$10 and a promise don't usually buy you more than a pair of boots, Martha May Caldwell muttered as she tightened the reins on her mare, watching the stranger stumble toward her lean ranch house. The sun had just crested the copper-red mesas, throwing long shadows across the scrubby ground. He wore a burlap sack over his shoulders and moved with the grace of a panther despite the weight he carried. May's pulse quickened, not for fear, but for a knot of curiosity she hadn't felt since her husband's grave turned cold. But let's go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, May Caldwell stood on this same porch as the last of her neighbors shuttered their windows against winter's approach. A widow since spring, she'd learned to embrace solitude. Endless chores, silent meals, nights spent listening to coyotes howl beneath the stars. Her ranch lay on the edge of the painted desert, land as harsh as grief, where only the toughest souls or the most desperate could survive. That afternoon, a faded poster flapped against the general store's bulletin board. Labor wanted, hard worker, willing hands. Pay, $1 per day plus lodge. May read it twice, her forehead wrinkling. $1 a day bought barely enough flour and baked beans to keep a man alive. But she'd been down to her last coins 2 weeks ago, cobbling together feed for the horses and splints for a broken fence rail. She needed muscle, someone to help mend the barn roof before the first snows fell. At dawn the next day, she rode into town, mare's breath steaming in the chill. The storekeeper tipped his hat when she asked after help. "Only one left," he said, jerking a nod toward the stables. "New arrival. Says he's Navajo. Strong as a stallion, quiet as a moonlit night. He's waiting by the hitch rail." May slid from her saddle to find him standing just beyond the hitching post. A broad-shouldered man draped in coarse wool, the burlap sack slung across his back shifting with each relaxed breath. Himetzi. His name rings in her mind now, strong man in his mother tongue. His dark eyes lifted, radiant under a ridged brow, and fixed on her with uncanny calm. He stood as still as a carved statue, feet planted firm in the dirt. "Job's simple," May said, dismounting and extending her hand. "Mending fences and roofing before the storm. Pays $1 a day and a meal. You in?" Himetzi's lips curved in something like a half-smile. He dropped the sack to the ground with a muted thud. "I will work," he said, voice low and even. $1. She nodded. "And board." He reached into his sack and produced exactly $1 silver, tarnished but stamped clear. He laid it on the palm of her hand, then straightened, brushing dust from his coat. "I keep the $1, he said. "You keep the work." May watched him lift the sack again. It seemed impossibly heavy for one man, yet he bore it as though it were a swallow's feather. Her jaw clenched. She'd never hired a man so proud he paid her to let him work. But necessity outweighed pride. She nodded, letting the coin slip into her pocket. "Thank you," she said quietly. Breakfast at dawn. That night, May lay in the dark sleep of a woman who has no one to wake for. At dawn, she brewed coffee thick as molasses and set a skillet of bacon to sizzle. She walked outside to find Himetzi already there, sack laid by the barn door, unrolling a heavy blanket like a mat. He stood and bowed his head in greeting. May swallowed. "Good morning." He returned the bow. "Ready." She watched him, heart pounding. She'd expected labor, but not ceremony. He unpacked tools, coil of rope, hammer, nails, and a stack of new tin sheets for the roof. In the rising sun, his muscles rippled under threadbare sleeves. May realized she'd never seen a man built like that outside the circus or an arena. He was powerful, yet his movements held a deliberate gentleness, as if every swing of the hammer was both duty and act of reverence. They worked side by side all morning. Himetzi climbed the rickety ladder with the sack. May handed up tin panels and nails. At midday, he stopped, handed her a rough chunk of wild honeycomb he'd foraged in the hills. "For strength," he said. She tasted it, sweet as prairie blooms. He dipped his fingers and ate from the same spot, eyes never leaving hers. The intimacy of sharing raw honey beneath the open sky turned her cheeks warm. She swallowed, caught off guard. "Himetzi?" she ventured, wiping honey from her fingers. Why do you work for $1? He paused, gaze drifting to the distant mesas. Because some things cannot be carried free. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of stories untold, of burdens accepted, of debts paid not in coin but in sweat and spirit. May felt a tremor behind her ribs, an ache she thought long buried. She realized this man carried more than the day's labor. He bore a history she couldn't yet fathom. But whatever sorrow lingered in his eyes, he offered her strength and humility in exchange for a simple wage. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, they secured the last panel. Himetzi climbed down without a word, shouldering the sack once more. May expected him to leave, but he lingered, shoulders squared, gaze on her. The day's work lay behind them. A patched roof, mended fences, and the scent of pine smoke drifting from the chicken coop. Dinner, May said, voice soft. Inside. He inclined his head. I would like that. That night, May served stew fragrant with potatoes and wild onions. Himetzi ate with quiet appreciation, dipping bread and offering her a knowing glance. When the stew pot was empty, he set the bowl aside and looked up at her. No words, just that unwavering gaze beneath the lamplight. May's breath caught. The world felt thinner, as though the distance between their griefs had dissolved. She realized the $1 he'd given her had bought more than labor. It had purchased a moment of shared humanity beneath a roof they'd made strong together. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. May rose and retrieved the silver $1 from her pocket, holding it out to Himetzi. Take back your $1, she said. I need no coin for this work. He accepted it with a nod, placing it carefully in his sack. Then he reached into his pocket and removed a small carved stone, smooth and dark, etched with a spiral. He laid it in her palm. For you, he said, because you gave me a chance. She closed her fingers around the stone, warmth seeping through. It was no coin, but a gift richer than any silver. May realized then that the simple act of hiring a man for $1 had opened her door to something far greater. An unspoken bond forged by labor, respect, and a debt of kindness that neither time nor solace could erase. As the night deepened, May and Himetzi stood on the porch, gazing at the endless desert sky. Without a word, they shared the weight of their pasts, and in that silent communion, they discovered that the most powerful debts were those repaid by the heart. As dawn broke over the painted desert, May Caldwell stood on her porch, the sunrise igniting the mesas in a blaze of rose and gold. The night's breeze had stilled, leaving the sky as clear and open as the future May dared to imagine. Himetzi, still draped in his burlap sack, now cinched neatly at his shoulders, stood beside her, hands folded before him. Between them, the cabin wore the faint glow of lanterns that had burned through the long night, guiding two souls toward a new horizon. Today, May said softly, we ride into town. Himetzi inclined his head. He dropped the sack to the ground and unpacked a fresh shirt, simple linen, dyed a soft brown, and slipped it on over his muscled frame. The gesture was quiet but deliberate. No longer a laborer for hire, he dressed now as partner in whatever lay ahead. May poured coffee from a chipped pot, the steam curling in slow spirals. She carried 2 tin cups to the rail and offered one to him. He accepted it with both hands, as though the warmth were not just a beverage, but a promise. They drank in companionable silence, savoring the moment before the world stirred awake. By mid-morning, they set out along the dusty trail, their horses' hoofbeats measured and sure. May rode Ember, her chestnut mare, while Himetzi guided his own palomino, each mount as steady as their rider's resolve. At the edge of town, the boardwalks teemed with merchants opening stalls. Bolts of calico, jars of preserves, hides stretched in the sun. Children chased chickens between wagon wheels, and laughter rippled through the air like wind over grass. May's heart thudded in her chest. She'd faced the desert and winter alone, but now stood on unfamiliar ground, her cabin's 4 walls traded for the bustle of cedar-shingled storefronts. Yet she felt no fear. At her side was a man who had carried more than any sack of tools. He'd carried the weight of his own past to stand beside her, equal in work and spirit. They paused before Whitaker's mercantile. Mrs. Whitaker bustled out, arms wide. May Caldwell, and you must be Himetzi. She clucked her tongue in approval. I've always said you picked the finest help in all the territory. She ushered them inside, where the scent of leather and pine cleaner mingled. We've saved a corner for your tools, Mr. Bell. Just let me know where you'd like them. Himetzi nodded, exchanging a look with May. Then, quietly, he produced the small stone spiral he'd gifted her. He placed it in Mrs. Whitaker's hand. For good fortune, he said, voice warm. The storekeeper's eyes softened. Thank you, friend. She tucked the stone into her apron pocket. You'll both be welcome here always. Outside, they continued down Main Street, drawing curious but respectful glances. At the saloon, Jonas raised a mug in greeting. At the blacksmith's, sparks danced as horseshoes met Enville. Each nod affirmed their place in this community, once strangers, now neighbors. May led Himetzi to the bank, where in the windowed office she withdrew the last of her savings, enough to pay for the year's feed, seed, and taxes on the homestead. I want to clear my debts, she said, and pay you fairly this time. Himetzi placed a steady hand on hers. We owe each other nothing. His dark eyes held hers. This land, this life, it's ours to build together. The banker cleared his throat, respectfully backing away. May slipped the coins into the teller's hand, then turned to Himetzi. Let's make our debts to the land. Mend my fences, plant my fields, and feed these horses through every storm. He smiled then, a slow, genuine curve of his lips, and she realized it was the first truly unguarded expression she'd seen on his face. It will be done, he replied. And more. That afternoon, they rode back to the ranch, crossing the open flats where wind-blown sage rippled like sea. May dismounted to inspect the fence. Posts straight, wire taut, and Himetzi worked at her side without hesitation. Under his care, even the fence rails seemed to stand a little bit taller, as if proud to serve such steady hands. As the sun slipped toward the horizon, Himetzi climbed the ladder to secure the final tin sheet on the roof. May watched from below, her chest swelling with pride. When he descended, he paused and reached into his pocket, retrieving the silver dollar that had begun it all. He handed it back to May, who took it gently. It belongs to you, he said. It bought more than labor. It bought a future. May tucked the coin into her vest, close to her heart. Then let it remind me, she whispered, that the smallest payment can yield the greatest reward. They stood together in the golden light, two figures silhouetted against the canvas of sky. The barn's repair, the mended fences, and the promise of fields sown for spring. All spoke of hope resurrected from hardship. In Himetzi's presence, May had found more than muscle. She'd found a partner who carried his past as openly as he shouldered his tools. That evening, on the porch of their shared cabin, they sat side by side. Himetzi strummed a simple melody on a worn guitar he'd carried in his sack. A song of home, of desert winds, of two lonely hearts tethered by trust. May listened, head resting on his shoulder, and let the music wash away the last echoes of her widow's grief. As stars emerged in the velvet sky, May turned her gaze upward. I used to think solitude was safety, she confessed. But I was wrong. Himetzi paused his song, fingertips stilling on the strings. He shifted to face her, hands cradling hers. Love, he said softly, is the only true shelter against life's storms. She smiled, a radiant curve of hope. Then let us shelter together. Under the silent vigil of desert stars, they sealed that promise, two souls bound by the currency of kindness, the labor of love, and a single silver dollar that had bought them far more than either could have dreamed. And as the wind whispered through the mesquite, the painted desert itself seemed to sigh in contentment, having witnessed the birth of something as enduring and precious as the land beneath their feet. A single silver dollar doesn't often buy you more than a broken fence rail, May Caldwell whispered, eyes narrowing as she watched the stranger lift the burlap sack from the dusty ground. The morning sun gilded his broad shoulders, muscles rippling under coarse wool, yet his face remained hidden beneath the sack's rough folds. Her heart pounded in her ribs, curiosity and something older, lonelier, stirring like a ghost in the breeze. But let's go back to where it all began. 2 months earlier, May stood alone on her porch at dawn, the scrubby expanse of the painted desert stretching to the horizon like a promise she both feared and needed. Widowhood had taught her resilience. Mending fences with stiff hands, coaxing crops from parched soil, and lying awake through nights when wind rattled shutters like dry bones. The ranch, once bustling with her husband's laughter, lay silent under a sky so vast it felt like judgment. That morning, she'd walked into Cedar Ridge for supplies. Flour, nails, and any mule feed she could afford. In the general store, Mrs. Whitaker met her with a knowing glance. "You hiring again, May?" she asked, voice soft but firm. "Winter's coming. You'll need help." May forced a smile. "Help's hard to find, and harder to pay." She fingered the last coins in her satchel. Just enough for 3 days of feed and the bushel of corn she'd saved. Mrs. Whitaker nodded toward the bulletin board. A faded poster fluttered against the wall. Labor wanted. Strong hands needed. $1 per day and bed. May studied the lettering, frayed at the edges. $1 a day bought little, but it spoke of desperation she wasn't ready to admit. That evening, May returned to the ranch. The sun bled out over red mesas as she climbed from her saddle, reins slipping through calloused fingers. She paused on the porch, listening to the wind sigh through mesquite. The barn door hung crooked, and fence rails sagged like weary bones. She'd held the ranch together this long, but this stormy season threatened more than broken wood. It threatened her last thread of purpose. At dawn, she rode back to town. The cold bit at her cheeks as she followed the mule path to the hitch rail outside Whitaker's. A lone figure stood there, tall, silent, draped in a burlap sack that looked as much a burden as a mystery. He shifted weight from foot to foot, hoofbeats echoing hollow in the crisp air. "May Caldwell?" he said when she approached. His voice was low, calm, a tone that settled dust motes in midair. He reached up, peeled back the sack's edge, and revealed dark eyes beneath a moss-green bandana. Eyes that held storm and stillness all at once. "You here for the $1?" she asked, scanning his broad frame. He dusted straw from his coat, movements precise as a dancer's. He nodded once. "I work for $1. May dismounted, muscles stiff from worry and grit. "And a bed." He laid the sack aside and lifted his chin. "If there is one." An ache lodged in her chest, half pity, half hope. She extended a hand. "I'm May Caldwell. This ranch needs strong hands. You start today." His fingers closed around hers, calloused, warm. "Himetzi," he said. "It means strong man in Navajo." She swallowed. Names carried power, and now she'd spoken his aloud. She led him toward the barn, boots scuffing the lean soil. Behind them, the ranch spread out. A cluster of weathered buildings, splintered with asking for repair, and fields already surrendered to frost's promise. They paused at the fence line, rails split and twisted. May gestured. "First task, mend this. $1 a day, your choice how fast." Himetzi dropped the sack. "I keep the $1, he said, voice steady. "You keep the work." She felt a thrill of disagreement prick her. No one paid her to hire them, but necessity forced her restraint. She nodded. "Breakfast in an hour." He inclined his head, lifted the sack again, and moved toward the fence without another word. May watched him shoulder the weight, muscles flexing under dawn's glow. The sight of him bent to labor, a man who paid her to let him work, pressed on her conscience like a promise she hadn't known she needed to keep. As she turned back to the porch, May realized the single silver dollar had bought more than sweat that morning. It had opened a door she'd kept locked against loneliness. Behind it lay a stranger's strength and secrets she couldn't yet fathom, and a decision that would reshape every hour of this harsh landscape. The wind sifted through the mesquite, carrying the echoes of hammer strikes and the thud of heavy boards. May paused at the threshold, hand on the weathered wood, listening to the rhythm of a life being rebuilt. One rail, $1, one heartbeat at a time. And somewhere beneath the rising sun, she sensed that when Himetzi looked up from his work, he would see more than a ranch in need. he would see a chance at something neither of them had dared to name. At dusk on the 5th day, the sky above May Caldwell's ranch burned like embers, streaks of crimson and gold that turned the painted desert into a living canvas. She stood at the edge of the corral, watching Himetzi unpack the last of his tools from that burlap sack. Together they had rebuilt fences stronger than before, replaced broken boards in the barn, and even coaxed an honest crop of barley from stubborn earth. Yet tonight felt different, marked not just by work done, but by something neither had spoken aloud until now. Himetzi emerged from the barn, shoulders broad in the lantern glow, hands calloused but gentle. His dark eyes met May's and held a question she'd been too afraid to ask. She stepped forward, heart knocking like a lost colt. "You've paid me more than any dollar could buy," she said, voice steady in the still air. "This ranch is shaped by your strength and by your silence." She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "But I want to know the man beneath the sack." For a moment, Himetzi said nothing. Then he knelt before her and gently removed the burlap hood. His hair, thick and ebony, fell around a face lined not by age but by wind and memory. There was vulnerability there, a soft invitation that startled May with its honesty. "My name is Chuka," he whispered, speaking in Navajo before switching to halting English. "It means bear, because strength can protect or destroy." His gaze flicked to the distant mesas, as if grappling with ghosts. "I came here to carry burdens, but because of you, I learned anyone can lay them down." May swallowed tears she didn't know were there. She pulled him to his feet. "Then let us walk forward without hiding." He nodded, and they stood side by side beneath a sky turning from fire to violet. In the soft hush that followed, May heard the first whispers of the wind asking for a promise, and she knew exactly what to give. They crossed the corral together, hands clasped, and paused at the barn door where horses nickered softly. May fetched a blanket and laid it across a low beam. Himetzi knelt and placed the burlap sack beside it, folding it flat. Then he lifted May's hand and pressed the single silver dollar into her palm. "It belongs to you now," he said, voice low. "It bought my work, but you bought my heart." May closed her fingers around the coin. She met his gaze. "And you've given me more than I dared hope for." She leaned in and brushed her lips to his, the desert wind carrying their promise deeper into the night. By moonlight, they stood at the edge of May's fields, barley waving in soft cadence. Himetzi drew one hand across the stalks, fingertips gentle. "This land," he said, "taught me that nothing flourishes alone." He turned to her. "May Caldwell, will you stand with me? Not just in work, but in life?" Her answer came in a quiet nod. Tears glimmered on her lashes, reflecting the moon's silver glow. "I will," she whispered, "in every sunrise and every storm." Behind them, the barn doors swung closed on the past, and ahead lay endless prairie waiting to be sown. Together, May and Chuka, once the lonely widow and the muscular stranger, would build a home where debts were repaid in kindness, and where two souls, drawn together by necessity, found their truest purpose in each other's strength. As stars appeared one by one in the high desert sky, the wind carried their laughter across the open plain. In that final moment of stillness, the world itself seemed to pause, and then to exhale, bearing witness to a promise kept longer than any lifetime, bound by a single silver dollar turned symbol of a love born under the vast painted desert.